regretfully, I'm not going to be able to see all of your faces and engage exactly as I would normally like to in a discussion and presentation of this nature, but I appreciate very much that you've all made the time to join us at various time zones for each of you. And let me just also add that if it happens to be your normal lunchtime, wherever you are calling in, please feel free, eat, drink, have a snack, because we're going to be here for a while, and I want to make sure everybody's comfortable during our conversation. As Karen mentioned, I am a Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, and I am currently on a 2-year detail assignment to the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, from which I am calling you and joining you. That said, these views are my own. The presentation is my own, and they do not represent the positions of the U.S. Department of State, nor the U.S. Air Force Academy, U.S. Air Force, or the Department of Defense. So without further ado, I would like to jump into the presentation. And as Karen mentioned, while we will have time for a more back and forth engaging conversation at the end, do feel free to post or raise your hand with a question, and we'll be happy to bring that into the flow of our conversation. So let's begin with where NATO began. There is generally a bit of a misconception that NATO is exclusively designed to counter the Soviet threat that loomed at the close of World War II. While attempting to organize the security infrastructure of the various original members of the NATO Alliance in the late 1940s to counter a Soviet threat, there were other purposes to the development of NATO. Principal amongst them was, again, deterring Soviet expansionism and interference in the domestic political goings-on of these various countries, but we were seeking to prevent the revival of nationalism, okay? And so let's go to the first slide, please, Karen, if you don't mind, and we're going to quickly go through where we're going to discuss, how we're going to discuss the topic. So we'll go over a quick background, all right? We'll talk about the history of NATO. We'll also discuss where NATO sat in the post-Cold War period, which drastically changed in the then post-9/11 time frame in which we find ourselves, the current conditions, which really have developed over the last several years regarding modernization and defense spending amongst the allies, the enlargement and expansion of various partnerships, and then the challenges we face. And finally, we'll address the future, which is as open-ended a question as you might imagine, because one, we now have the COVID crisis, which has sort of upended pretty much all thinking on all topics around the world, but also because as technology and geopolitics develop around the world, NATO and the individual allies will need to adapt to these challenges and look for the ways that they can leverage this most successful alliance to meet those challenges. So let's go to the first slide where we talk quickly about the background and history of NATO. So again, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded to address 3 broad efforts. I mentioned 2 of them. One was, of course, deterring Soviet expansionism, but we wanted to prevent and forbid even the revival of national militarism in Europe. And one of the ways that this was done was by basically gathering together the efforts, the military efforts, security apparati of the various allies. And by grouping them together, the idea was that they would not compete with one another. Creating a common purpose would prevent that competition. And then, of course, encouraging European political integration. And I'd like to put a little bit of a fine point on this, because one of the things that I think is often lost in the discussion of how successful NATO is, and it is the most successful military alliance in the history of the world, by creating this umbrella of security, this protection for Western Europe at the beginning of NATO, it also created the space that allowed for political and economic integration. Many people recall that the European Union is actually not that old, and it began many, many years before as a coal and steel cooperation agreement between the founding original members. And the reason for coal and steel specifically is those were the material necessities to fight war. at the time. And so by gathering together these industries and sharing these resources in a European framework, not the NATO transatlantic framework, they were able to share in the resources and also keep track of what each country was doing. If suddenly there was one country that was stockpiling steel and coal without any plausible economic basis, there might be some suspicion as to their motivation. And of course, that didn't happen, fortunately. And this security blanket allowed for this economic cooperation, which allowed eventually for political integration. And there's very many people who write today about the success of the EU is owed in large part to the success of NATO, because they worked in tandem. And so it's something to really think about, because today we think of the EU as a major partner in our economic and political engagement with the world as Americans, and indispensable in terms of leveraging each other's strengths. But the EU itself might not have come to be without the origins of NATO security in first Western Europe and then throughout the European continent. So I just want us to think about those three broad efforts that gave rise to NATO. And let's move on to the next slide, where we'll go a little bit more in depth. So what were the founding principles of NATO? What were they hoping to accomplish in creating this alliance? Well, one is Article 5, with which we are all intimately familiar. You hear about Article 5 all the time when you hear about NATO. It's the attack on one is an attack on all. For most of NATO's history, at least for the first 5 decades plus, the belief was that an attack would come from the East against Europe, invoking Article 5 and relying on an American response primarily. Interestingly enough, of course, the first invocation of Article 5 occurred after September 11th in response to a call by the United States on our Euro-Atlantic allies. So it's something to keep in mind, where many people talk about the different give and takes, the costs and benefits of the alliance for all members, not just the United States. But it is important to note that in the midst of these discussions of how we all leverage this alliance for our mutual defense, is that the assumption was America would come to the rescue. And in fact, America sought the invocation of Article 5 for the first time in the alliance's history. But then we get to Article 3. Article 3 talks about military preparedness and cooperation. And this is an important aspect of NATO. And it's something I'd like to talk about for just a moment, because we also hear often, and we will talk about towards the end of the presentation, discussions of defense spending by the allies, burden sharing by the various allies. What Article 3 talks about is not only could the allies cooperate in their military preparedness, but they are actually obligated to prepare for their own national defense prior to an Article 5 invocation. And so something that people don't realize often is that there is an expectation that no member of the alliance will be a net consumer of security. They will all be net contributors, which makes us stronger than the sum of the parts. In theory, this means that every country would be able to hold off an attack or defend their territory. Now, in practice, what that really means is responding to crises. Nobody expects some members of the alliance who have smaller populations, smaller GDPs, and so forth, to have the full spectrum defense and security framework that, say, the United States or France or Britain have. But in terms of responding to natural disasters or some sort of low impact insurgency or invasion, the idea is that these countries can respond first and bring in the alliance on the back of that response. So it's something really important to think about, because we do talk about defense spending now, and we do talk about burden sharing. And that very discussion is predicated on Article 3, which doesn't get as much attention as Article 5 does. But more importantly, the idea of getting each nation prepared for its own defense under Article 3 permits and opens the door for cooperation, which means the idea that we can all supplement and complement each other's efforts, And we'll get into that a little bit more as we get into the current challenges and direction of NATO. But it's important to remember again that as we crafted the Atlantic Treaty, the idea was that this would be an alliance of the whole built on strong foundations of each individual capacity and cooperation between countries to build that capacity. And then finally, Article 2 allowed for non-military cooperation in a number of fields, which has, again, opened the door for a wide array of educational and scientific cooperation, research, development, which at times does have a military security defense component, but can have other civilian benefits. Once you build out infrastructure, highways, bridges, ports, it can have a military benefit when you're trying to provide logistics, supplies, but frankly, it also has an immediate impact on the daily lives of people and their economies and their prosperity. I just want to pause there. I did hear something, and I just want to make sure that there's not a question or anything I can address now.
I don't believe so.
Great. Super. Let's move on to the next slide, as long as that's clear. So let's talk about the membership of the alliance. Now, I mentioned earlier the idea that the security umbrella of the NATO alliance allowed for the political integration and the economic integration of Europe. But Europe was focused on politics and economics, whereas NATO was primarily focused on security. And one of the ways you can see that clearly is that not every country in its original founding membership was a democracy. In fact, for many years was not. Portugal lived under a military dictatorship. But in time, there was a push for democratization and integration that went in tandem with the development of European political and economic integration and the expansion and enlargement of NATO. But the original members, not surprising, victors in World War II, as well as some other countries in the region, like I mentioned, Portugal. Now, the expansion, the enlargement happened rather rapidly. Greece and Turkey were brought in a few short years later. That was to help protect the southeastern flank, the eastern Mediterranean, and of course, to provide that space to protect those countries from Soviet aggression, both politically as well as militarily. West Germany was brought into the alliance as it started to reform itself and begin to develop the institutions that would allow for the post-war recovery and eventually leadership on the continent. Spain, after the end of the Franco dictatorship, also was brought into the alliance. But the enlargement has continued. And as I said, one of the reasons for the enlargement was not just security, okay? It was to create a framework for further political and economic integration, because security, prosperity, and democracy are all goals of the transatlantic vision and the cultural values that we share. So this is just a quick timeline of the early stages of enlargement, but we can move on to the post-Cold War and explore quickly some of the expansions that took place. So first, you had the Yugoslav conflict, you had the Caucasus, and these revealed a severe power vacuum. Once the Soviet Union fell, you had the development of independence movements in places that had either been subjugated by the Soviet Union, or in the case of Yugoslavia, these pan-national political entities that sought to go their own way for a variety of reasons, and there are experts who can speak to the causes of those. But overall, once that outside force was removed, there was conflict, and the question was, who can come in to prevent this conflict in Europe or on the doorstep of Europe? And of course, the idea was NATO was the most logical actor. Frankly, the idea was NATO was seeking to create and maintain peace in Europe. Conflict on its doorstep obviously required a response. And so NATO, most famously engaging in Kosovo, but also, of course, all the other conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, etc., came in and acted to stop violence, stop these conflicts, create a political solution to them, and as we'll see moving forward in this timeline, open the door
for the Western Balkans at a minimum, and even Caucasus states, to move towards greater integration with the Euro-Atlantic world. So immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, you saw some countries rush to join the NATO alliance. So the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. All right. Shortly thereafter, Bulgaria, where I previously served, and the Baltic states, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And then more recently, in the last decade plus, you had Albania and Croatia, again, Western Balkans, Croatia, former Yugoslavia, Montenegro as well. And just recently this year, the membership of the Republic of North Macedonia, which was a major achievement, which really brings us back to the conversation of the tandem relationship between the European project and the NATO alliance, because without the work of our European partners to resolve some of the issues between North Macedonia and Greece, there would have been a veto on North Macedonia's membership. And so there was a lot of important political efforts made by the United States, absolutely, and our European allies to find a resolution to bring North Macedonia into the alliance and further along the path towards full Euro-Atlantic integration. I would also add, by the way, that if memory serves, I think it was 2008. In 2008, there was an invitation made to Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance at some future date and to set up a path for that end state. And there's also talks about a membership plan for Bosnia and Herzegovina. So as you can see, if you can visualize a map of Europe, it's about filling in those spaces to create the area for political and economic integration, as well as an overall security apparatus. But for many people, NATO is the antechamber to Europe. And for others, vice versa. There are certainly members of the European Union who are not members of NATO, although they work very closely with NATO and with NATO allies, and certainly do contribute to some of those non-military but crisis, natural disaster response efforts that I mentioned earlier in the discussion. So I'll move on to the next slide, and we have 9/11. So for most of the post-Cold War period up until September 11th, 2001, the focus was on bringing countries into the Euro-Atlantic world. There were some disputes over it, some conflicts, some concern about how that might rile Russia or what that might do about bringing in countries that had quite a long way to go in terms of modernizing and developing their militaries, the military doctrine, the institutions, civilian control, and all of the other elements that were explored, examined, and reformed in the transition from the post-Cold War period to where we find ourselves today. But the conversation was generally about which direction and which pace we would bring these countries in to that broader Euro-Atlantic world. Now, with September 11th, the question became, what will NATO do? What is NATO's purpose, and how will they respond to an attack on the United States? Again, Article 5 speaks to an attack on one is an attack on all. And so NATO took over command and coordination of what was known as ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. Now, when I was in Afghanistan, there was a transition from ISAF to what's known as the Resolute Support Mission, the train, advise, and assist component of what was previously more of a kinetic engagement against the Taliban. But for all of that time, I worked very closely with my NATO allies. And in fact, there was a great deal of symbiosis going on between our mission at the US Embassy and the NATO mission at ISAF. Principally, we were looking at what's known as a SOFA, a Status of Forces Agreement, which would allow US and NATO forces to remain in the country with legal protections and certain doctrines and rules of the road for conduct, and how we would support the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces. And NATO and the embassy worked hand in glove to make sure that we were able to provide the greatest support to the Afghan security and defense forces, whilst protecting our individual men and women in uniform who would be on the ground doing the train, advise, and assist mission. But again, it was NATO that took on this significant role. Again, the United States had a major role to play, had a large footprint, had its own had its own chains of command through the embassy and other formats. But at the same time, again, NATO came in to help with the International Security Assistance Force and make sure that this first major mission outside of theater, again, the idea originally was, one, Soviet aggression within Europe and a fear of invasion. And yet here was an Article 5 invocation on behalf of an attack on the United States, responding to an action outside of the European theater. So it's an interesting intellectual exercise to think about how such a successful alliance and such a powerful force for good in the world can have unintended and quite positive applications outside of the realm of the original vision of its founders and its growing membership. And so one thing that I always remind people about NATO when I discuss this alliance is we don't know on September 10th, 2001, what and how NATO is going to be used, but we've already seen its use in this very unexpected way. And so we should cherish the fact that it was able to rise to the occasion, able to live out its mandate to protect all the members of the alliance and act in concert with one another. I would also add, by the way, that the enlargement of NATO also does reflect some of the membership in the NATO command and coordination of the ISAF mission, because the North Macedonian military was present in Afghanistan years before they joined NATO. And Bulgaria, for example, has been on the ground and continues to be on the ground in the KFOR mission, which continues to ensure stability and security in Kosovo. And so you have a number of countries that merely the aspiration to join NATO has focused their energies and lives and treasure in many cases towards these international security, peace, and stability operations on behalf of these global missions. So it is a pretty remarkable organization that has lasted so long, to think that it inspires action, positive action, by aspirant countries who have no guarantee of future membership, and yet they rise to the occasion to join these efforts. And of course, the demonstration of their capabilities, bravery, and commitment to these values, of course, helps in the process of their membership. And the same thing applies, I assume, again, I don't work for the European Union, but the same pathway towards membership in the European Union, again, there's that first hope for membership that inspires actions for reform of judicial codes and for political reform, economic reform, to help better the lives of the individual peoples of these countries, that then eventually helps them to join the European Union. So again, NATO and the European Union, working hand in glove on many of these shared values, provide this inspiration and hope. And while I was in Bulgaria, Bulgaria hosted the European Council presidency, a rotating 6-month presidency as part of the operating functions of the European Union. And they made a special designated series of engagements on Western Balkan integration. And they put themselves forward as quite an inspiring mentor, if you will, on where they had been, where they had gotten to, and where they were going, as a template for some of the Western Balkan countries who had not yet joined NATO or the EU, or in some cases just NATO and not the EU, to aspire to those positive trend lines on those economic, rule of law, and political reforms. So again, I don't want to lionize NATO beyond the reasonable, but what it comes down to is it has inspired people for generations now, and it has, when tested, lived up to its promise in a way that has brought in the shared commitments of people who aren't even members yet. So it's just something really to keep in the back of your minds when you think about the success, the true success of NATO, not just its longevity, not just its enlargement, but its actual utility in the world for positive change. So let's move to the next slide, and we'll talk about the current conditions, which really are the most pressing matters in the alliance today. So first of all, modernization and defense spending. These sort of go hand in hand. Some members of the alliance were former members of the Warsaw Pact, and many of them still field Soviet-era material and platforms, MiG aircraft and other equipment. And so what we want to make sure is that, one, under Article 3, that these countries are able to defend themselves. Well, some of this equipment is decades old and quite obsolete insofar as matching modern platforms. So we also want the ability for that military cooperation that I talked about under Article 3. And so if everyone is working towards acquiring and fielding NATO interoperable equipment, F-16s and other aircraft, for example, what you have is economies of scale. And while I was in Bulgaria, there was a major achievement insofar as Bulgaria, after many, many years of working through very difficult issues, was able to secure 8 F-16s to replace some MiGs and Sukhois that they owned from those prior years. And what that means is many of their neighbors also fly F-16s. And so again, you have joint training, you can have joint spare parts procurement, fuel depots, etc. And that just makes the alliance stronger on a bilateral, multilateral, and whole of alliance scale. Frankly, I benefited from the efforts of many of my predecessors and many of my colleagues working towards this goal of the F-16 acquisition. But once that happened, the train has left the station, and Bulgaria is already talking about securing a second tranche of F-16s to build out their air force. The issue is, one, the maintenance of MiGs or other aircraft from the Warsaw Pact era requires spare parts maintenance and other resources from Russia, which means a pipeline of funding and dependence on Russia. So modernization is key, not just for building capacity, but for shifting in a whole of country fashion towards the Western alliance and away from this dependence on Russia. More importantly, the countries made a commitment in Wales and Warsaw in 2014 and 2016 to meet 2% of GDP spending on defense by 2024. And of that 2%, 20% on the procurement of new equipment and platforms. And so what Bulgaria has done is nothing short of miraculous, given the size of the economy and the purchase that they made. They easily now hit that 2%. And many countries have done that. So when those commitments were originally made, there were very few countries spending 2% of GDP on defense. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Of course, we had the economic crisis of 2008 and onward that did a lot to national budgets. And one of the reasons it wasn't absolute numbers, but rather a percentage, was to reflect the realities of the cyclical nature of economic health of countries, regions, and the globe. But the defense spending targets have taken on an almost, how to describe it, an almost sort of like missionary zeal amongst many of the countries. And even General Secretary Stoltenberg mentioned the other day that the countries have increased the percentage of their defense spending now 4 years in a row. This began, this push for increased defense spending and meeting the Wales and Warsaw commitments began under President Obama and Secretary Gates. It continues under President Trump and Secretary Espers. And frankly, the achievements of many countries, all right, are somewhat miraculous. You've had, in that time span, right, you've had some economic crises in Europe. You've had migration crisis in Europe that strained a lot of resources in those countries. And you even have now COVID-19, and that will present some challenges in the future, which we'll talk about. But where you went from a handful of countries having met or exceeded the 2% target to over a dozen, to now a majority of the alliance having a credible plan to reach the 2% threshold by the 2024 deadline, is quite miraculous. And the return on investment is tremendous as well, because one, newer aircraft, newer vehicles, newer ships are, one, easier to maintain, are maintained through more reliable supply chains, not reliant on Russia for example. And again, the economies of scale allow for greater cooperation, greater partnership between neighboring countries. It won't always require the US to come in to do a training exercise, the US to come in to do an air policing exercise. Right now, Bulgaria is set to take delivery of F-16s. Well, Croatia, Romania, Greece, Turkey, to name a few of its nearest neighbors, are all flying F-16s, and they can do training exercises together. And it's quite an impressive thing to watch. I was there when Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania hosted Sabre Guardian 17, and it was a massive military exercise that brought together over 20 different allies and partners, and nearly 25,000 military personnel from those countries. And again, being able to work together and coordinate their efforts, from communication equipment to, again, spare parts and other material, just makes the alliance stronger. I want to pause
David,
this. I think I saw a chat.
There's a question, yes.
Please.
It's from Semi. He said, who came up with the idea of NATO? Was it the US?
Who came up with the idea of NATO? Well, the idea of NATO came about through a variety of different conversations by world leaders, even during the war. The famous photo of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt at Yalta talked about the organization of the post-war continent. And there was certainly thinking then about what was needed to do to prevent another outbreak. Remember, this was of the generation that had witnessed what was believed to be the war to end all wars in World War I. And so they were very, very cognizant of the risk of a repeat of this conflict one generation removed. And of course, in the atomic age, which was ushered in at the end of World War II, that was a terrifying prospect. And so you had thinkers all over the Euro-Atlantic world thinking of ways to prevent this crisis from happening. And again, it happened in multiple tracks, right? The replacement of the League of Nations with the United Nations was part of the thinking of how to prevent the problems that plagued that organization. Many people don't realize the League of Nations was legally in existence until 1947 and was replaced by the United Nations. And so the idea was, how could a permanent defense apparatus be created to prevent the rise of, again, competitive nationalism, militaristic nationalism, and to prevent the perceived and anticipated aggression from Russia? Because, again, Winston Churchill gave the famous speech, the Iron Curtain speech, when he traveled to Missouri, and he saw clearly the threat that the Soviet Union posed. So it was a collection of thinkers. It was a collection of thinkers, and it came from a variety of sources. Again, there's a famous George Kennan was a U.S. diplomat. I don't want us to take credit for everything, but George Kennan wrote what was known as the Long Telegram. And in the days of telegrams, wrote back an analysis of the Soviet Union, its psychology, its cultural, social, political construction, and its view towards the world, and basically described it as having a almost fanatical attempt at expansion, and how containment had to be put into place. That was George Kennan who helped frame the containment, and then later, as that was translated into the domino theory of response to Soviet aggression. And so all of these came in together to help give life to the NATO Alliance. Now, I will add, one of the reasons that Portugal may have been added, because again, it's not geostrategically on the front line at the time, not a participant in World War II. Actually, just as an aside, the United Kingdom and Portugal have the longest lasting operational peace treaty and alliance defense agreement in the history of the world, as far as I'm aware. And so that might be one of the reasons why they were brought in, because of the framework of the UK-Portuguese agreement. So okay, I hope that's helpful.
I have another question from Maria.
Please, absolutely.
Why didn't European countries under NATO handle wars and genocide nearly as much as the US? I am thinking of Clinton's intervention in the Balkans.
Well, I mean, the amount of ink that was spilled then and since then is interesting. One of the issues is capacity, okay? We just have the ability to project power and to create the logistical supply chains necessary to sustain operations far from our shores much better than many countries in the world, even those countries that are closer and still quite capable. And so that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it always has to do with political will and the idea that it was difficult to get a decision to engage and intervene in the post-Yugoslav disintegration, if you will, without US leadership. This was the very end of the Cold War. There had not been, for many decades, a European leadership, because the idea was America, you've heard the expression, leader of the free world, and the idea was that, as you know, we were still talking about the very early 90s, and the idea was America had to lead to motivate and organize this cooperation in that region, because again, people were afraid of national militarism, adventurism with European countries. So having one or two European countries take that on, I think probably amongst their domestic audiences, amongst their neighbors, and within the framework of at the time it was the European Economic Community, probably was not palatable and possible. Again, you could read countless articles from the time and since that discuss the various actions and motivations in each country, but that's my general thinking of it. But again, when we decided to take action, we were joined by our allies in a very positive way.
All right, I have.
There are more questions? Yeah.
Yes. This is from Hans Hisken. Support for NATO in Europe is diminishing because some Europeans don't understand why NATO troops are fighting on other continents. They don't believe this to be in the NATO Charter. What does NATO do to better explain their overseas mission? And then I'll just follow up. We have
Great question
on the chat.
Yeah.
Is the $400 defense system purchased by Turkey a challenge for NATO? I'll stop there. There's two more written questions,
Sure.
or four more, but we can stop with those two questions at the moment.
Sure. They're both great questions. Well, so first of all, country by country, there are differing views and polling that reflect the appeal of the total architecture of the Euro-Atlantic world. So you sometimes see very pro-NATO, pro-American views in countries that have more of a skeptical, or as it's described as Eurosceptic kind of leaning. You have some countries that are much more pro-EU and somewhat skeptical of NATO, usually in part because of the guns and butter debate. You know, they say, well, listen, we want to improve our healthcare system or our pension system or this, that, and the other thing. And these defense expenditures are quite expensive. And are we facing a threat? Is this something that's necessary? Now, that's one of the reasons that the defense spending commitments were put in Wales and Warsaw. But there is a public affairs campaign that was launched, hashtag We Are NATO. It's been very successful because one of the things that it does is it highlights individuals and groups from specific countries to speak to their own domestic audience. So it would be Italians speaking to Italians, Bulgarians speaking to Bulgarians, etc. And it's been somewhat successful in trying to put, one, a human face on what NATO's doing and describing why we're trying to do it. Now, I can't speak again to any specific mission. There's certainly some people who have grown fatigued with the operations in Afghanistan or in Iraq or other places. And of course, NATO is in Afghanistan. Some NATO allies were and are in Iraq. I would say that, political and social polling obviously is not linear, it's not flat. And there's a lot of work that NATO has to do, I think, to promote itself. And NATO recognizes that. Some of the contributions that NATO is doing, as I mentioned before, have immediate tangible benefits to the vast civilian populations of European countries and North American populations as well. And it's not as obvious. It's not as evident. I'll give you an example. The NATO Alliance has launched what are called centers of excellence. These are basically academic facilities that have very, very specific specialties. For example, Bulgaria specializes in crisis management, natural disaster response. In Spain, they are excellent at their training in responses to IEDs. In Estonia, some of the work that the Center of Excellence does is focus on cyber. Well, there's no doubt that the work that's being done at the Center of Excellence in Bulgaria has massive benefits to the entire population of Europe and beyond when you begin to develop redundancies, response plans, and coordinations of resources for flooding, landslides, earthquakes, and all other manner of natural disaster or other crises. The same goes for Estonia's work on cyber. Frankly, I am concerned on a daily basis about hacking my bank account, things of that nature. I'm not terribly worried today, maybe I should be, I'm not terribly worried about a cyber attack that's going to shut down the entire electric grid on the Colorado Front Range. Okay, maybe I should be, as I said, but what's being done to defend against that less likely hostile act can certainly protect me from hackers in my bank account, etc. And so this needs to be pushed out there. This needs to be communicated better. You know, one of the things that large organizations are great at doing is meeting the goals that are their missions. Patting themselves on the back and self-promoting is not always their forte. And it's a shame because, again, what NATO has achieved for the peoples of Europe is tremendous. And what it's continuing to achieve for all the members of the alliance is incredible. And frankly, you know, you look at some of the countries that say, well, maybe we shouldn't be working outside of theater. Okay, but again, where might the next attack come from a terrorist organization that finds safe haven in a country like Afghanistan or in that region? I don't know. I hope nowhere. But ultimately, what NATO's doing is designed to defend against those possibilities. And self-promotion is not its forte. There was a second question about the S-400.
Yes, and let me just jump in here. I just want to acknowledge that we actually have another question which is related. Brad Byers says, how should we think about Turkey's involvement in NATO after purchasing and deploying the S-400 air defense missile system? So related.
So again, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General Stoltenberg has talked about the challenges that are faced by a variety of members' actions. The S-400, the most glaring, and our current administration has spoken out about the fact that we see that as an unacceptable development that has pushed Turkey for now out of the F-35 program. So there has been already a response. The question is, where do we go from here? There's concern, of course, about what the S-400 represents. Does it represent, cooperation or some sort of further integration with Russia for the procurement and supply and sustainment of military hardware? But like I said, there's already been a response, and I think there's been already from individual countries and the alliance some expressions of concern. And to that end, I would add also that we know that there's been quite a bit of tension between Turkey and the EU and Turkey and individual European countries for many, many years now, that sort of, I wouldn't say adds to this, but it certainly informs the response of NATO. I mean, there were conflicts between the Dutch and the Turkish authorities, Germany and the Turkish authorities, most of the continent regarding threats by Erdogan to, as he described it, to release or push millions of migrants into Europe. And so there are a lot of concerns that you see raised by policymakers, academics, politicians, the op-ed pages of major media outlets. And so people are focused on this issue. There have been some responses, and I think that it's one of those things where we have to watch this space. I mean, clearly, the S-400, if, as we understand it, is designed to defend against NATO equipment and platforms, well, then there doesn't seem to be a purpose to its utilization and deployment by Turkey in a way that benefits the alliance. And so there's going to have to be a lot of deliberations on that. And I think that, you know, you've heard conversations about, you know, NATO and EU responses to countries regarding democratic governance and their current domestic political conditions. And this just becomes that much more glaring because of the military and defense component to it. But right now, as far as formal responses go, there have been expressions of dissatisfaction and concern, and there was the exclusion from the F-35 program, which Turkey was poised to join, even I believe this year. So again, there has been a response, and it's obviously considered very, very serious by many members of the alliance.
Would you like to move on with the slide, or would you like me to go to the next question?
We could go to another question, sure.
Okay, so Rusty Stevens, what's your perspective on NATO as a resource in resolving the Eastern Ukraine situation, not just militarily?
Well, as I mentioned, the 2008 summit, again, I believe it was 2008 summit, I can double check that, did issue a communique that spoke to future membership by Georgia and Ukraine. And so it's a very serious matter. Russian aggression in a lot of different areas certainly is seeking to create conflict, frozen conflict, as it's described, to prevent the membership of certain countries. And it's quite a challenge. It's quite a challenge. But again, the reason that Russia is likely taking a role in places like Georgia and Ukraine is because they're not NATO countries. Their actions there, whether direct, indirect, are not part of the NATO Article 5 vision, right? It does not rise to an Article 5 event. So how we can work together is through, as was asked in the question, is through non-military means, but there are security and defense measures that can be taken through training and partnership. So for example, there is a air defense exercise that's carried out every other year in northern Bulgaria. It's called Shabla, and Ukraine participates. Ukraine, Serbia, Bulgaria, the United States, and some others participate. We cooperate in this. On the tail of the Sabre Guardian 17 exercise that I described, there was what's known as a port operation, in which a maritime operation from a port in eastern Bulgaria on the Black Sea in the port city of Burgas moved with naval vessels from Ukraine across to Georgia for a docking operation as a exercise in resupply and support. So these exercises exist, these operations exist, and the ability to help promote their capacity through these exercises far short of NATO involvement on the ground in Ukraine is absolutely taking place already. Ukraine's a very capable country. If you look at the history of that conflict, they had a very limited military capacity, and yet they scaled up their military industry to be able to respond to the challenges of what's happening in eastern Ukraine. And of course, in recent years, the Trump administration has provided a great deal of what's known as lethal aid. Now, this is just media headlines and describing different types of aid. They like to use fancy words, but we have provided Javelin anti-tank weapons, and you can research that. And there's been financial support by a number of European countries who are NATO allies. And so there's a whole spectrum of ways that we're supporting our partners around the world through training, through capacity building, and through other means of support.
All right, let me go to the next question. Joanne in Baghdad. NATO has a mission in Iraq to work at the ministerial level and is considering expanding its role. What do you think of a NATO role in the world more broadly?
That's well beyond my pay grade. But what I would say is NATO already has a large global presence. As I mentioned, many aspirant countries have looked to NATO as a as a template for the modernization and reforms that are necessary. Bulgaria, for example, and I don't mean to keep going back to it, I just happen to have more data points on that than other countries, but used to have a massive military that was well beyond its needs. And so some of those reforms went to conscription to a professionalized army, to training operations around the world, to exercises that professionalize that military. And that was, again, in the lead up to NATO membership. The United States has something called the State Partnership Program, in which after the fall of the Soviet Union, individual state national guards partnered with different countries. Tennessee is Bulgaria's partner, for example. And even before NATO membership, so we're talking now over 25 years, Tennessee's National Guard was helping in that process. So whether it's an individual NATO country or the NATO Alliance as a whole, or some collection of NATO members, that has been happening. Now, when you say the world, you know, if you're talking about an alliance that goes, you know, to the four corners of the globe in terms of membership, you know, I don't think that that's on the table. I'm not privy to those conversations. You don't really see any evidence of it that I am aware of. But again, we have been active globally in a variety of ways. Our partnerships, the NATO partnerships, extend to North Africa, to the Middle East. The United States has designations of major non-NATO allies that exist in Eastern Asia, for example, Singapore, etc. So, you know, to say that NATO is going to become from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to the Global Security and Prosperity Treaty Organization, I don't think that that's part of anyone's discussions or thinking now, but it's obvious that it still inspires positive change in countries, reform, modernization, etc., as I've mentioned before. And we are already acting outside of theater, such as in Afghanistan. So the question would really probably be circumstantial. You know, if there's a conflict that leads to NATO engagement, as was mentioned, at a ministerial level, or some sort of technical support for the development of certain capabilities, you know, that would be taken up by the NATO Council and discussed. But you know, as far as it becoming a global alliance, I'm not aware of any serious discussion on that topic in that direction.
All right, AF in Cincinnati. How do you interpret French President Emmanuel Macron's comments in November 2019 that NATO was, I quote, brain dead, unquote?
Well, I would refer obviously to the French president's office, to NATO, and to others who responded to that. You know, comments are made about all manner of human institutions that sometimes reflect broad analysis, sometimes a narrow topic, sometimes they're ephemeral based on passing conditions. So, you know, I'm not sure, but I would refer obviously to the French presidency on clarifying and elaborating on those comments. What I would say though is that you know, the countries that make up NATO are democracies, and so they have domestic audiences, all right? And within the European Union, they have a continental-wide framework of audiences. So there's any number of reasons for specific language, critique, et cetera, to be applied to any number of issues. One thing I would say, though, is when you're talking about NATO, all right, one of the things that people tend to harp upon that I tried to disabuse everybody of at the beginning was that it was merely designed to stop Russian aggression, right? And with the fall of the Soviet Union, there were people in the 90s talking about either the dissolution of NATO or even bringing Russia into NATO. Obviously, neither of those happened, and I think we're grateful for a variety of reasons on both counts. But NATO has evolved, NATO has enlarged, NATO has adapted and expanded its mission, and it has had to respond to global events. And so some people have found there to be a need to either push it in one direction or to
trigger thought experiments in where it might go in the future. And frankly, that's a healthy thing to keep the alliance relevant and in a democratic society to be able to have those discussions. And one example I would give is, remember, France withdrew itself from part of the structure of NATO, but remained an active contributing member of the alliance for many decades. And that shows also that the alliance is quite capable of disagreement, even though it's a consensus-born body. It's quite capable of disagreement, even public disagreement. And that really is a testament, I think, both to its sustainability as well as its adaptability, you know, for many years in the future.
All right, wonderful. Carl Schneider is asking, as quote unquote diplomacy wanes under the current administration, or at least the tone and tenor of it has changed, how has NATO, from its multiple layer engagement, been able to maintain diplomacy amongst our friends and allies? Is NATO keeping the fires warm for future better diplomacy, quote unquote, times?
Well, just diplomacy is an interesting tradecraft. Again, getting back to the conversation of domestic democratic politics and audiences versus closed door discussions, you know, I have to say that with respect to diplomacy in the world, or more specifically diplomacy within NATO and with our European allies, there are always things happening behind the scenes that may be better than what we see on the front page of our newspaper, or there may be things that are quite more serious and grave behind the scenes than what is potentially a rosy outlook in public media. And so, you know, it's hard to say exactly what the impact of diplomacy will have on the alliance. And diplomacy is a multi-tiered, multilateral exercise. For example, you know, you'll recall in the lead up to the war in Iraq, there was a great deal of criticism about our efforts to depose Saddam Hussein. And yet there were a number of European and NATO aspirant countries who joined us in what was dubbed the Coalition of the Willing. And the seeming diplomatic fault line took place between some Western European countries and some Eastern European countries. You'll recall the label of Old Europe, New Europe, or something to that effect. And, you know, we have an extraordinary long-term, deep and broad relationship with our European allies, non-NATO partners within the European Union, and non-NATO partners beyond the alliance. And some of these disagreements and some of the cooperation that we see, again, publicly or privately, are built on a multi-generational framework of cooperation and trust. And so I would suggest that while our current administration is different than our prior administration, which is different than our prior administration, and so forth and so on, going back to the beginning of the alliance, the alliance itself, the bilateral relationships, the multilateral relationships that exist are extraordinarily resilient and sustainable. As far as I hope no one can hear, there's some honking going on outside of my house. As far as the current administration, you know, frankly, I have seen positive developments with the defense spending targets, as I mentioned, that have taken place in the last several years. General Secretary Stoltenberg has highlighted the positive impact that the Trump administration has had on moving us towards those goals. And so I don't think that the conversation that happens necessarily in the op-ed pages of various news outlets, which you know, I used to be a member of Facebook, and I stopped many, many years ago using social media, in part because it just seemed like everyone was yelling at each other, and I didn't think that I was learning anything from it. And so, you know, I think we need to look past that and look for the more concrete actions that we see taking place. You know, obviously, you know, there was conversation for the last several months regarding Ukraine, right? And yet at the same time, the tangible, kinetic, what was called lethal aid that was provided to Ukraine from the United States was a significant upgrade from prior years in the conflict that they're currently engaged in. So I would say that you've got the practical, you've got the rhetorical, you've got the immediate and ephemeral, and then you've got the long term. And so there's various ways to look at it. Again, my relationship with my counterparts in the Bulgarian Ministry of Defense and Bulgarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, was extremely, extremely cooperative and cordial. And I was impressed all the time by the capacity and contributions that they were able to bring to the table. Again, smaller country with you know, smaller pool of resources on which to draw, but diplomacy continues, and diplomacy often happens in strange ways and a lot of times behind the scenes on these personal relationships that are built to advance these mutual goals. The form is not as important always as the substance, but you know, everyone has a different opinion on that topic. You know, you have some people that argue that what could be a short-term gain could be a long-term harm, what could be short-term harm could lead to long-term benefits. All very difficult to really guess at when you're looking at long-term horizons in a narrow election cycle. But again, we have persevered and we continue to persevere. And my relationship, again, with my counterparts in NATO countries has been phenomenal.
From Hans Hisken, many European NATO members are at best 50% operational when it comes to tanks, fighter planes, and ships. Shouldn't this be a concern? And what is being done about it? Where is the 2% of GDP being spent, if not on maintenance?
Well, it's an excellent question, and it's one of the reasons that the Wales and Warsaw commitments were articulated in the first place. As I mentioned, of that 2%, 20%, and trust me, I hate doing math as much as many of you probably, but the 20% of the 2% is supposed to be spent on procurement of equipment, tanks, planes, etc. The target date is 2024, okay? And in that time, there were countries digging out of the economic crisis of 07, 8, 9, 10. There were countries that were impacted by the social and economic costs of the migrant wave, 2015, 16, thereabouts. And so the goal is for these monies to be spent in exactly the direction you're talking about. It will take some time. And there's a difference between spending money and the actual delivery and the operational deployment of these platforms. But that is the idea behind the commitment. And again, this is a multi-administration bilateral effort. President Obama and President Trump have the same message on meeting defense spending. Secretary Gates, Secretary Espers have the same message on meeting that burden sharing. And the fact of the matter is, as Secretary General Stoltenberg said, over the last 4 years or so, the amount of defense spending has skyrocketed by several hundreds of billions of dollars within the alliance. Now, you can make the argument that you can't make up for monies not spent previously. Sure, true. But we're here, we're now, we're moving in the right direction. We started, again, at a handful of countries that were meeting or exceeding that target, and now we are in the multiple, well, not multiple dozens, but we are well in excess of a dozen countries, and nearly the whole alliance has presented what is known as a credible plan, as certified by NATO, to reach that goal in the next several years. So I think it's a positive thing. And one of the reasons for that 20% was, you could just hire a bunch of people and put them in uniform and say you've hit the 2%, but that's not going to create that Article 3 self-defense and cooperation for the eventual, hopefully never needed again, Article 5 invocation. So the 2% is critical, but the 20% of that 2%, I think, is the most salient in response to the question that was raised, and that's part of that plan.
Sorry, there we go. Another question from Maria. What are your thoughts regarding the inequity in contributions by the allies toward NATO?
Well, look, every country has different capabilities, different sizes of population and economies. And that's why the target was a percentage rather than some number, right? If tomorrow you said, okay, you have to spend $100 and your economy grows 4% that year, well, it's much easier for you to spend $100, and then people are going to say, well, you're not carrying the burden. But if you have a recession and your economy contracts 4% that year and you're still targeted with spending $100, that's going to hurt in a way that would be very difficult to, one, shoulder, and two, defend, again, in a democratic society. So if everyone gets to 2% and others choose to spend 2.1, 2.5, 3, etc., again, that's their choice. But the idea of the 2% and 20% is to make sure that everyone is contributing that agreed upon amount. And so frankly, at a certain point, look, you could have a few countries in NATO all contributing 3.5%. I mean, Greece happens to have a large defense budget. Poland happens to have a large defense budget. The United States happens to have a large defense budget, the UK, etc. But, if everyone hits those Wales and Warsaw targets, I think we'd all be happy if everyone spent more money on defense if the need arose. But we also have what's known as capability targets. And the capability targets are a mechanism within NATO that says, what are you supposed to be providing for yourself and to the alliance, right? Nobody needs Latvia to field an aircraft carrier, right? That's not one of their capability targets. All right, what their capability targets are tailored for their country, their region of the alliance, perceived threats in that region and to the alliance, and their overall contribution to NATO. All of the countries have these different capability targets, and so you want to tailor those capability targets to threats at the national, regional, and alliance-wide level. You want them not to be redundant, so you want them to complement each other. Okay, you want them to recognize that they have to work within the framework of the 2% and the 20%. And they want to work as parts of a whole. Again, if NATO decided tomorrow, we need to have the capability of 1,000 tanks, and we said, we have 1,300 tanks, right? Someone spending their money on an extra 100 tanks is not going to meet a capability or fill a capability gap of NATO. And so this is an extremely well thought out process, an extremely impressive decision-making exercise by the allies to make sure that there are complements. Again, not every country in the world is going to have the full spectrum military capabilities of the United States: air, land, sea, space, cyber, etc. Okay, some of them are going to have niche capacities that will then complement other allies to help build out a full spectrum within the alliance. Okay, and so my perspective on it is that each country takes this 2% and 20% target. They take these capability targets. They take their own national defense in concert with the Article 3 considerations, and they work together in cooperation. Now, that could mean the United States supplying things. That could mean domestic capability development, et cetera, et cetera. But we are looking at a major effort by all the allies to achieve these goals in parallel with each other. So my capability target says I should be able to do X, and I have to spend another 0.2% of GDP. Well, that's probably where I'm going to spend it. Now, I've got domestic audiences. I've got things to consider in that respect. Now, as far as inequities, we also have certain needs to be present in Europe that require some spending, and we do look for sharing. You've seen discussions between South Korea and the United States, between Japan and the United States, about updating the defense agreements that we have and how money is spent to maintain a U.S. presence there. And that's an ongoing conversation, but that's an ongoing conversation that's been happening for decades. And with respect to NATO, once you get to that 2% and 20% target, I think it makes that conversation a lot easier to have, but it's all within that framework of the capability targets and the Wales and Warsaw commitments that I think help us all speak from the same vocabulary. And I think we're moving in a very positive direction.
All right, from Wayne Artis. What is the current status of Serbian/NATO relations? Do you see potential for increased cooperation?
Well, so when you look at the Western Balkans and you talk about filling in the map, as I mentioned earlier, Serbia does stand out as a challenge. For one, they are a close Russian ally. For another, they obviously still maintain a number of outstanding issues regarding Kosovo, and NATO had a major role to play in Kosovo's independence. That said, there are a number of European and even NATO and European countries that do not recognize the independence of Kosovo. So it's a very complex issue. And but at the same time, as I mentioned, Serbia participated in the Shabla air defense exercises that took place in northeastern Bulgaria a few years ago, and there are some levels of cooperation. The politics of the Balkans are incredibly complex. The cause of conflict in Europe that have stemmed from there, if you've ever read the book Balkan Ghosts, if you've ever read The Peace to End All Peace, different books that explore the causes and the conditions of politics, culture, society, and history in the Balkan region. It's fascinating. It's a beloved region of mine. I enjoyed living there, traveling there. I spent a great deal of time in many of the countries in the region, and it's really it is a challenge because as each country sees itself moving in one direction or the other, you're not going to be able to herd them all in one direction simultaneously. And there will be a need for a domestic clamor for a change in the direction of Serbia's relationship with Russia and with the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. What I can say is I have seen many academics and policymakers comment on the fact that it could be one of these situations in which the EU happens first, NATO happens eventually, because there is a great deal of lingering feelings towards NATO, towards Kosovo, towards the United States regarding that conflict. When you go to Belgrade, in front of the parliament, there is a banner listing a number of photographs, hundreds of people who died in that conflict. And there is language and messaging that blames Albania, or Albanians, I believe, and NATO. And so there's scar tissue, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I would point, though, to the fact that our relationship with Vietnam is markedly different than our relationship with that country from just a generation or two earlier. And so things do change, conditions change, perspectives change, cultures, while they don't change rapidly, they tend to evolve with these externalities. And my personal opinion is that Serbia is a country that does not wish any ill will or hostility towards the European Union, towards the NATO Alliance, but there's that outstanding issue regarding Kosovo, and so that's going to be a sticking point. They do have a close relationship with Russia. There are historical, religious, cultural, linguistic ties to Russia, and that's present. That's reality, and it's certainly something worth watching. I would suggest, though, that the desire to be part of Europe, whatever that means. I mean, Switzerland is very much part of Europe, even though they're not part of the European Union, for example. My brother-in-law has an Austrian passport. He lives in Switzerland under certain agreements and so forth. So there's going to be a multi-generational move, I believe, in Serbia to try to be as integrated in that European or Euro-Atlantic world, socially, culturally, etc. And if that translates into institutional membership or something short of institutional membership, I think that that's probably a direction that they're moving. How fast it moves, I would have no way of knowing, but it's certainly one of those question marks that stands out, because where Montenegro, Albania, Croatia are in the alliance, obviously the aftermath of the disintegration of Yugoslavia has other repercussions within the region.
All right, another question from Sami. How does the nationalistic trend in Poland and Hungary affect NATO?
Well, so there have been some articles written recently about what this means for the Euro-Atlantic institutions. Most of the emphasis has been on issues of European Union cooperation. Again, it's a consensus organization, and so there's some concern about the actions taken by different countries in Europe in relationship to Brussels. Meaning, you know, if there are decisions made in Brussels that certain countries don't agree with, are they in defiance of Europe, or are they able to, you know, act as a veto or block on those decisions? So I would say that right now, the developments in Poland and Hungary are being closely monitored. I would say that you know, our diplomats on the ground and European Union officials and representatives are certainly looking at some of the changes, reforms that are taking place in these countries. Viktor Orban famously declared himself to be an illiberal Democrat at one point. But, you know, the issue really stands at, you know, how the actions taken by different countries manifest themselves. So, for example, if the decision is taken to amend a law that seems to limit the number of media outlets versus controlling or affecting the messaging of media outlets, they seem like two sides of the same coin, but they are different for practical purposes. That said, you know, NATO was not founded as a democratic organization, although it does have democratic ideals and values that it promotes. Again, one of the things it should be most proud of is helping to create the space for the democratic and political integration and development of Europe. But Poland and Hungary are having their issues with Brussels, and for now, I think it really seems to be a EU matter. There are countries within Europe that seem to be, I would say, a bit disheartened by some of the legal changes that have been taking place there. There are some countries that don't seem to be bothered by them. There is a sort of coalition of countries that feel that they're able to stand with one another against what they see as a democracy deficit or a sovereignty encroachment by Brussels. So it's a little bit more complicated, I think, than just saying Poland and Hungary have done a few things that we would not consider to be you know, preferable in our political system. But again, we're all individual countries. We're all democratic countries. And, but at the same time, from their country's perspective, they're saying to themselves, we don't want to be told by Brussels what to do across the board. For example, during the migration crisis, Hungary and Poland said, listen, you know, we were under the Nazis, we were under the communists, we want to be able to chart our own course, and we don't want to be told that we have to take in different peoples from different places en masse just because of decisions made in Brussels. Again, it's more seemingly an EU issue right now than anything else. But you know, that could change. That could certainly change. But I think right now it's more or less an EU issue.
All right, I think we have got through all the questions for the moment. Shall we continue? Do you have more slides?
Well, let's just look at, again, the enlargement and partnership. I just want to draw attention to quickly because, again, NATO has continued to add new members, again, most recently this year with the Republic of North Macedonia. We do forge partnerships with other non-NATO countries that I think are invaluable, and it gets that earlier point about helping countries like Ukraine. And I would suggest, if anyone's interested in looking at the full spectrum of partnerships, NATO has a wonderful map on their website that shows it's color-coded. And so you've got different initiatives in the Mediterranean, different initiatives in the Caucasus, and so forth. And I think it's an incredible format, because it also brings together countries that might not otherwise cooperate, not necessarily that they're hostile towards each other, but they just might not either have the capacity to do so, or they might not even just think to do so. And so it brings some people into exercises and other capacity building that I think, again, getting to another question about going beyond NATO in a more global sense, helps to bring neighbors together and say, hey, listen, these are three countries that, hey, have you ever thought about operating some coastal monitoring operation? Let's work together and bring out some maritime exercises to your waters, and let's get some communication and cooperation. And that could be a seed that continues to grow well outside of any significant investment by NATO or individual allies. So it's something just to think about, a very positive contribution of NATO. And then we get to challenges. Again, I don't want to repeat everything that Secretary General Stoltenberg said, but he identified a number of challenges: growing capacity and activity by China, by Russia, the threat of terrorism, of course. I don't think many people have had a chance yet to look at the impact of biological challenges in the context of COVID, but there have been a lot of medical and bio research programs under the auspices of NATO that have existed for many, many years. And so that's extremely helpful to know that it was already in place before this outbreak, and will certainly receive added attention and, I would imagine, added resources to address these future challenges. So let's look to the next slide on the future. I think that that speaks volumes. The question of the future of NATO is an open one, okay? Nobody on September 10, 2001 thought that NATO would be utilized in Afghanistan in response to an attack on the United States for the first invocation of Article 5. So what is the future of NATO? Every single person who writes on this topic has a different opinion. There are some people who write and say that with the challenges in the European Union, you've had conflict between East and West, North and South, on economic issues, on migration issues, on rule of law issues, and we've addressed some of them here. There may be a vacuum that's created that NATO helps to fill as an organizing institution. Possibly, possibly. There are some people who speak to the fact that NATO will find it does need not global membership, but broader global action because of the shrinking world in which we live in and the impact, the global impact that things like, say, coronavirus can have in one place like Wuhan all over the globe. And so the future of NATO, again, it's unknown. There are writers and thinkers who are trying to craft that course. One future, one obvious future, is enlargement in the Western Balkans, I think, for sure. Whether that goes beyond in the near future, well, it was a slow process to get us to where we are now from the fall of the Soviet Union, and even a slow process to get us to where we were in the 1990s from the 1940s. But I would say that the future of NATO is assuredly bright, because the indispensable need for this alliance, I think, is obvious to all. And where and when that does fall short in terms of that self-promotion that we discussed, quite frankly, I think that there's every opportunity to do this sort of outreach to explain to people how they have already benefited and how they can benefit. And it's just a matter of utilizing the resources necessary to do it. But nothing like NATO has ever existed in the world. And the positive benefits of NATO to each individual member, to the safety, security, and prosperity of Europe, again, creating that space that allowed for that political and economic integration that led to the current European Union, I think is obvious to all. Now, if we find ourselves challenged by something that is, again, totally unexpected, okay, we can revisit this space. Will NATO meet the challenge of an armada of alien invaders? Hard to say, hard to say. But I will say that whether it's helping non-NATO nations, say, defend their sovereignty and protect themselves in the South China Sea or in the Caucasus or in other parts of the world, and that could mean in terms of cyber or in terms of physical space, the reality is NATO is well poised to meet those challenges. These centers of excellence I mentioned earlier are designed to have that fine-tuned, laser-like focus on specific challenges that can then be scaled and brought to bear. And so I think to imagine that we will predict everything about the future of NATO or the challenges they will face 10, 20, 30 years from now, that's impossible. But to say that we will have the resources that can be directed towards those challenges and not only justify the continuation of NATO, but to celebrate the continuation of NATO, I think is self-evident. And, you know, I'm a big NATO booster. I am a big supporter of Euro-Atlantic security and the many, many different alliances that the United States has throughout the world. And we benefit allies. Discussions, disputes, disagreements do happen, for sure, but they have and they will. And I think that how they're resolved will leave everybody better off for the next stage. So I will leave it there. I don't want to, I don't know how long we've been here, about an hour and a half. I know that folks allotted a set amount of time. We just finished in a little under 90 minutes. I'm free to talk for other questions and take other questions. And I want to thank you all again very much for taking the time to join us from wherever you are in different time zones. It's an important thing to remain connected to people, to remain engaged on important issues, to remain engaged on issues that are outside the most immediate, right? We see in our newsfeed every day, corona, 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 economy, 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 economy. But we need to be global thinkers and we need to be future thinkers because this too shall pass and we'll have other challenges and other opportunities in the future. And again, thank you for joining me.
I just want to thank you, David, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise about this topic. I know that we all enjoyed it. And thank you for all the participants who logged in today. Thank you for attending CxC Amplified. Remember to support your local World Affairs Council. And for more information, check out CxCamplified.com. There are events going on all day Thursday and all day Friday, I think further into today as well. And if you would like to join the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council mailing list, please visit our website at csworldaffairs.org. Thank you so much, and thank you again, David.